My name is Molly O'Rourke, and I am an executive in residence at the School of Communication, where I'm also the co-director of the master's program in political communication. So this is a very exciting time for the program, for all of us on campus, and I'm very excited to be here this afternoon, and that there's interest in this session. Maybe some of you are here because you've really wanted to explore polling and public opinion research, and I always want to do whatever I can to inspire and encourage people, students, to become researchers and to become trained in research methodology and to sort of see the many important strategic uses of public opinion data. But maybe some of you are also here out of frustration with so many polls being released. I know it can be hard to make sense of them and to reconcile what they all mean, especially when we're in a very heated election where there's differences in polls, and those differences can mean have significant consequences. The difference between the two candidates being tied in a state or someone having a 2-point lead could be very consequential given the Electoral College and the way things are going to play out over the next couple of weeks. So let me just give you a brief overview of my plan or my goals for today's session, and then we will go ahead and jump in. So first, I want you to leave the session feeling like you're a more informed consumer and evaluator of polls. So I want to convey in a relatively short amount of time an important skill set that will almost be like, I hope, a checklist that enables you to evaluate polls, which ones you should be paying attention to, which ones you should discard and not put much faith or much stock in. I also want to provide a little bit of an overview of what happened in 2016 when it comes to polling. There was and still is, I think, a sense that there was a failure of polling in the 2016 election, and that's not really the case. For somebody like me who has spent a couple of decades in public opinion research and polling, I remember a particularly bad moment on election night in 2016 where I was watching results come in on various cable shows, and had trailed off and fallen asleep in the wee hours, and I woke up to a talking head saying something to the effect of, well, 2 things died tonight, and they are Hillary Clinton's presidential aspirations and the polling industry. So that was very discouraging. I don't think that's true, but I will make some comments about kind of the pretty serious industry-wide study and evaluation of what happened in 2016, what needed to be improved, and how that's being reformed. So the next time you're in a conversation and somebody says, well, we can't trust the polls, look what happened in 2016, hopefully you'll be able to respond with a little more of an informed point of view. And then my final goal or objective or plan for this session is to also talk a little bit and help a conversation around the limitations and the proper use of polling, because public opinion survey research, polling, is both an art and a science, but it is not magic. And the trouble with polling, I would argue, lies more in how it is used and actually how it is misused in today's news environment. And that happens honestly because people don't understand the limitations, and they're not sort of honest and transparent about what the limitations of public opinion research are, and instead sort of use polling or data as a shortcut to answer questions that are really much deeper and not truly answerable with public opinion research. So I'm going to jump into my, I have a couple of slides prepared to talk to, and I had thought that the best way to run this session would be for me to just run through the PowerPoint and try and save questions for the end and for discussion. And to the extent that it really is a discussion where, you know, we want to get various points of view, I still think that would be the best way to do it. But because we have a smaller group here, I will try to keep an eye on the chat room. I admit I'm not as great at multitasking as I could be or should be. So if you really have a question, you can go ahead and jump in or put something in the chat room. And as I said, I'll do my best to keep an eye on it. So with that, let me see if I can coherently, without losing anybody, share my screen. Okay, I'm going to now, can you all, I'm looking at faces while I'm sharing my screen. Give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen. Wonderful. Okay, great. So let me go ahead and jump in and go to the first slide. Here are 3 things that I think you should consider when you're evaluating a poll. And I'm going to go through each one here, and then I have some follow-up slides on them in a little bit more detail. And actually, I should say at the outset, I think one of the positive developments here, and maybe especially in the wake of 2016, is that there's been a real effort between researchers in this field and journalists to help train and coordinate better between research outlets and reporters, so that reporters themselves are aware of some of these strengths, weaknesses, and limitations, so that when reporters are out covering and describing and reporting on polls, they themselves can help filter some of this information and make some of these important decisions about the quality of polling before they just kind of automatically get introduced into the news stream. So the first point here is around methodology. And methodology refers to a few things. Primarily, I'm talking about how the data is collected. So whether the data is collected online or by telephone. If it's by telephone, is it a robocall, which probably many of you have been asked to participate in. You know, you press 1 if you want this candidate, or 2 if you want a different candidate, or is it a live interviewing call? And I'll talk through kind of the strengths and limitations of different ways to collect data, but how the data was collected should absolutely be part of the consideration for thinking about whether a poll has value and is a quality poll or not. And then the other aspect of methodology is when it was collected. So particularly this month, as you all can appreciate, when the poll was, quote, in the field, or the interviewing was live and being conducted, is highly relevant. I mean, just in the last 8 days, there have been at least 8 different news cycles that have changed how people might react to certain fundamental core questions in transformative ways. So you'd want to know, if a poll was released today, was this poll done, but was the interviewing done after the president's COVID diagnosis? Was it done before? When we were 10 days ago, a lot of the polling that had been done was just before the announcement of the Supreme Court vacancy. The methodology refers to how data was collected, when it was collected, and those are all very relevant in how you would report out the findings. The sample is also very important. So by sample, I mean a couple of different things. The sample composition is who was interviewed, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Is this a poll that was done among all registered voters? Now, commonly you'll see a reference to likely voters instead of registered voters, because we're getting closer to election day. What's the difference? Which is more appropriate? Which is accurate? And is a difference a 2 or 3 point difference in how a poll is, how 2 different polls are reported? Could that difference be attributed to one being done among registered voters, another being done about among likely voters? And those are 2 somewhat different audiences. The sample size for the poll is also a really important consideration. Generally speaking, the more interviews that are conducted, the more reliable your projections back to the broader population are going to be. So, you know, a rule of thumb, and there are always exceptions, is that the larger the sample size or the larger the number of interviews, the better. But that isn't always the case, but definitely understanding the number of interviews that were done is critical to evaluating whether a poll is a quality poll or not. And then the third consideration here is around question wording. And I'm going to show you or walk you through some examples of how question wording makes such a significant difference in the findings that you get and how the findings, I think, should be appropriately reported. The question wording may be a little bit less relevant in terms of the presidential trial heat question. That's a little bit more of a straightforward question, but even then, do you want to, in the question wording, do you want to ask about the ticket, support for the ticket, and mention the vice presidential candidates? Are you just going to ask about the presidential candidates? Would you include an other or not sure or undecided option? So those kinds of decisions, question wording, even in something as straightforward as who do you plan to vote for in November, are really important. And question wording really matters when we're asking about and reporting on data that is about emerging topics, because researchers, in order to do that, have to supply respondents with enough context to understand the premise of the question. So even something that might be reported on today or tomorrow, do you think there should be a presidential debate next week? If that's what you intend to measure, there are a lot of decisions you would have to make in framing that question. Would you include mention, for example, that the debate commission came out either last night or today saying that with their partnership with the Cleveland Clinic that they don't think it can be done safely? Would you mention President Trump's coronavirus diagnosis in the framing of that question? Would you frame the question about whether the debate should happen at all, or whether it should happen virtually, or whether it should be postponed? So all of those important decisions about question wording are kind of the onus of the researcher, but honestly also part of your responsibility as an informed consumer of research to not just take the summary or the headline description, but to really look behind it. So you could see a headline coming out tomorrow or over the weekend. Majority of Americans say that there should not be a debate next week. The first thing I'd want to know is, how is that question framed? And go back and look at the question. And I want to make an important point here. I think it's an important point, is that there's kind of a conspiracy theory that pollsters or public opinion researchers try to cook their results by asking biased or loaded questions. And yes, absolutely, bad questions are included in surveys, and that happens. And I've done my fair share of, or I've been guilty of the same. But most often, that's unintentional, and no researcher really wants to be embarrassed by having asked a bad or a leading question, and then the results are reported, and it's just an embarrassing situation for everyone. So scrutiny around these three things, around methodology, around the sample, how big the sample was, around the question wording, I think that increased scrutiny, and we've seen a lot more of it since 2016, that's a good thing. It's a positive thing. I just want to, while we're on the question wording example, just really quickly give an example of question wording that was a failure, and a pretty notorious failure. And this was asked by the Gallup organization that has a great, a very good reputation, neutral, have done a lot of important trend benchmarks over the years. But this is a question that was asked on a national Gallup poll. And you can maybe just imagine, close your eyes and imagine you're on the phone, it's dinner time, and you're trying to participate or cooperate in this poll. You're probably multitasking, maybe getting dinner ready. and somebody reads you this question, does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? That was a question that made it on a national poll, and the headline was pretty shocking when the poll came out. 1 in 5, 22% of Americans say it's possible that the Holocaust never happened. That created a lot of alarm among historians, among advocates, thinking, gosh, what is going on here that we have 1 in 5 Americans not understanding, believing that the Holocaust may not have happened. And it produced a lot of, a lot of attention, a lot of panic. There were a lot of people commenting on, what we're doing wrong, what are we teaching? Do we need to do better in terms of our K-12 curriculum? And then somebody went back and looked at the question and thought, that's a double negative, and people may have just been purely confused by the question. And Gallup, to its credit, and as I said, the idea that researchers intentionally ask confusing questions, I think is far, far overblown. And when somebody raised this issue to Gallup, Gallup looked at the question and said, you're right, that's a bad question. And at their own expense, they redid the poll and asked the question in a different way and got a completely different result. So anytime you see a result that you think is surprising or suspicious, typically now a reporter or most major media outlets will not cover a poll unless the researcher provides the entire script of the questionnaire and the order in which the questions were asked. And that should be a hyperlink on an article about the poll. You should be able to find it in public release. And that kind of transparency is good, because we can go back and look for ourselves to see, how was the question asked? Could respondents have been confused? Were the response categories balanced or not? And those are the kinds of things that I, through this session, really want to encourage you to kind of dig beneath the headlines, dig beneath the surface, and be able to know what criteria you should apply. So let me walk you through a couple of additional points. We talked a little bit about the sample size, or I mentioned, and one of the typical questions that's asked is, well, how big does the sample need to be? And also, how could a survey of 1,000 adults really meaningfully be representative of the entire American adult population? And those are really good questions. The margin of error and the sample size are directly tied through an arithmetic formula. And so the more interviews that are done, the lower the margin of error, which means the greater your ability to project to the larger population. One of the things we know is that, so why not just always do a large sample? Why not always do several thousand interviews? And the reason is simple, it's cost. It costs a lot to each interview costs, adds a fee to the budget, and media outlets are increasingly, under tighter budgets. And you can imagine doing a national poll, doing 1,000 or 1,500 interviews may be affordable, but we're now in a position where all of these polls are being replicated in battleground states. To be able to go and do a poll of 1,000 voters in 8 different battleground states, that's 8,000 interviews, and it becomes costly very quickly. And so that's kind of the realistic reason that we don't do larger sample size in all of our polling. It's really a budget issue. It also takes more time to complete that number of interviews. But you can see, and we did in 2016, a lot of surveys done at the state level that are as small as 400 interviews. With 400 interviews, you have a margin of error that's at about 5%. And that's pretty significant, as I'll show you in the next slide, or in the next example. Being able to, oh, sorry, we're just jumped ahead a slide. But being able to increase the sample size and report on the sample size and the margin of error is a really significant, is a significant issue. The screening questions of who is interviewed, that's also really important. So I mentioned earlier that right now, and it's kind of early to mid-October, we're starting to see polls transition from reporting on registered voters to likely voters. So the way you can think of this is almost like there's a pool there's a larger population of registered voters. We know that not all registered voters are going to vote in November. We don't know what the actual model of turnout is going to look like. And so we model turnout and we ask screening questions. We ask people about their intention to vote. If we have their vote history, which we do on voter lists, we can look at how often they voted in the past. And we start to take this larger pool of registered voters and narrow it to a smaller pool of likely voters. Now that's a judgment that we're making as researchers about, regardless of what you tell me, I'm going to apply my own set of evaluations about whether I think you're likely to actually vote in November or not. And the difference between this larger pool of registered voters and this smaller pool of likely voters, they're two different audiences. And so there can be significant differences between the preferences and the findings of those two different audiences. Typically what happens is that the closer we get to election day, the tighter, what we call the tighter the screen is. So the more we're really trying to project very carefully who we think is actually going to turn out on election day. Before the convention, or maybe even when the primary season ended, we were still doing polls among registered voters, because we really at that point were months out from the campaign, the vice president, from the election, the vice president, at least on the Democratic side, hadn't been selected or announced yet, the conventions hadn't taken place. Campaigns matter in terms of determining who is going to make it from the pool of registered voters into the pool of likely voters. Campaign resources are spent kind of ensuring that the people who are sympathetic to that campaign turn out to vote. So we start kind of it may be appropriate 6 months out from an election, back in the spring, to be reporting on registered voters. You would be, I think, more hard pressed right now to go look at polling that's being released, whether it's by NBC or by CNN. You will see that there's been a shift from registered voters to likely voters. And that shift is small, but it's significant. So understanding who are the results being reported among. And then I mentioned earlier in terms of the call dates, especially in an October that seems already like every day has been a pretty significant October surprise. You want to know which of the October surprises are reflected in your findings. So a lot of polling was done just before the president's COVID diagnosis, just before the Supreme Court vacancy. And you have to make a determination as a consumer of the research, and also, as somebody who's going to be evaluating and using it. Does this make the findings less relevant? How do I think the findings will have changed? If the political landscape and the political dynamic has changed in the week since when the interviewing was conducted, how cautionary should I be in thinking about the findings? So in the first slide, we talked about different methodologies of data collection. And here are 3 typical methodologies. There's still the traditional telephone interviewing, and by that I mean with a live interviewer. The live interviewer should, by best practices, be reading a script that's very straightforward, should not be interjecting any of their own views or taking any liberties with the questionnaire. It does allow a level of control that you kind of know the respondent is engaged and not just jumping around in the survey and asking things randomly. So traditional telephone polling is still kind of considered the highest quality polling. It is also the most expensive. And I think 2020 will represent a real turning point, where 2016 was almost all traditional telephone polling. 2020 is a hybrid. There's some of both. I think by 2024, there will be very little traditional telephone interviewing being done, and we will have moved to other methodologies and other platforms. Then the second type of phone polling is robo, or we call IVR, interactive voice recording polls, where it is an automated audio script, and you respond. It can be done much less expensively. It's more impersonal, which has its advantages and disadvantages. And you can imagine you can't go into a lot of depth on a particular topic, because remember, you're asking people at the end of the question to press 1 for yes or 2 for no, or 1 for approve and 2 for disapprove. So you're not going to be able to ask open-ended questions or things on a 10-point scale, or, you know, strongly approve, neutral, you know, questions that require more nuance and elaboration are not well suited for robo or IVR polls. And then the third type of data collection or platform is online surveys. I think this is where the industry, this is where the field is headed. We're, as I said, sort of in a transitional year. It is less, online interviewing is less expensive than traditional phone polling because you don't have to pay an interviewer. You can go into depth because respondents have the ability to actually be reading on the screen. They can reread something. You have access to different tools and bells and whistles. For example, placing candidates on a heat map, for example, rather than a traditional, you know, feeling thermometer of 0 to 100. You can add a more interactive component to the questions. Online surveys typically are less representative than traditional phone surveys, at least in theory or academically, because you have the bias of not everyone having access to an online platform. But when you look at the response rates that the industry has with traditional telephone interviewing, which are now like a good response rate to a phone survey is about 3%. The balance or the trade-off between the dismal response rates that we're increasingly getting with traditional telephone polling and the bias that we know we're introducing through an online survey with not everybody having access, those trade-offs are becoming a significant discussion. There are advantages and disadvantages to both, but it is certainly kind of increasingly going to be a part of the conversation. And as online access becomes more universal and becomes more ubiquitous, I think that we will continue to see a surge or a rise in online platforms. So let me just give you a tangible example of, okay, this is a survey that's done in the state of Minnesota, considered a battleground or a pivotal state. And this is how the results are going to get reported by the news outlet. Biden's at 41, Biden's at 47, Trump's at 41. So the headline could easily be Biden leads by 6 in Minnesota. What's behind this? Some of the things we've just covered. This would be reported in the write-up of the poll. How many interviews were done? 800 likely voters. So likely voters as opposed to registered voters. So we know we've already made, the researchers have made some evaluations and determinations for themselves about who a likely voter is. And arithmetically, at 800 interviews, the margin of error is 3.5%. So what that translates to in terms of interpreting the results is that while our best estimate is that Biden is at 47 and Trump is at 41, with the margin of error, Biden is somewhere between 43.5 and 50.5. So that's taking his 47 and adding or subtracting the 3.5% margin of error and doing the same thing for Trump. So Biden's somewhere between 43.5 and 50.5, and Trump is somewhere between 37.5 and 44.5. When you look at this, what's over here on the right, you can quickly see how the headline that Biden has a 6-point lead in Minnesota becomes a lot more nuanced than it appears. Because while that is our best estimate, and that is what the result of the poll, with the margin of error calculated into that, there is less confidence that that lead is as big. It could be bigger, right? The lead could be at that very outset or the outer margins of the margin of error. Biden could be sitting at 50.5 and Trump could be sitting at 37.5. That's a very significant difference. But at the other end, it could be that actually it's, it's close to being tied. Biden could be at his at the low end of his of the margin of error at 43.5, and Trump could be sitting at 44.5. So understanding margin of error is something that I think is like the least reported aspect and most important caveat of polling. It's directly related to how many interviews were done, which is directly related to the cost of the poll. And so all of those things, I think I've noticed really in 2020, reporters are doing a much better job of reporting the margin of error, and especially when the headline of who's in the lead is affected by whether the margin of error, whether it's inside or outside the margin of error. I think that's a real improvement and a good sort of dynamic for 2020, but it's absolutely like one of the first things that should be considered when any headline leads, when any headline shows that somebody is in the lead. So I mentioned earlier things about question wording. This is just from 2016. We faced the dilemma. How should we frame the presidential trial heat, if you will, which is just the question of who are you going to vote for? Should we ask it as a two-way trial heat, meaning Trump versus Clinton? Or should we ask it as a four-way trial heat with the third-party candidates who are on the ballot? And let me just show you the difference between reporting on what we call a two-way versus a four-way trial heat. And again, these are sort of technical terms that we as researchers deal with every day. But when the story or the findings are reported out through the media and sort of make it into the into public conversation, these really important distinctions often get overlooked. So what you see here on the left is this is from the exact same poll. So this is from the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that was taken in September of 2016. And the question was asked two different ways. First as a two-way trial heat. And you can see in the two-way trial heat, Clinton had a 9-point lead over Trump, 49-40. And the question was asked, who are you going to vote for? The explicit options were Clinton or Trump, and there was or are you still undecided? And 11% of voters said that they were undecided. When the question is asked with named third-party candidates, meaning Johnson and Stein were included in the question stem, Clinton's lead narrows from 9 points to 4 points. So she goes from 49-40, a lead of 49-40, to a lead of 42-38. Look at what happens to the support that she has is getting sort of disproportionately disseminated across some of the third-party candidates. And so even knowing if you are the editor, political desk editor at NBC, and you've got to write the headline or the first 30-second clip for Meet the Press on the Sunday morning that this poll comes out, do you want to start with Chuck Todd saying, our latest NBC Wall Street Journal poll shows Hillary Clinton with a commanding 9-point lead over Donald Trump? Or do you want to start with a very different sort of 30-second intro to say, this is a 4-point, narrow race. And so just those two questions, which are from the same poll, and deciding which ones you're going to report on and which ones to have faith in, those are really significant decisions that should be, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer to that, but it has to be sort of thoughtful and explained and transparent. So let me show you this, also another example of question wording. This is less related to the presidential race, but as I said in the outset, especially when we're doing public opinion research around a new and developing story, right? Where you have to give respondents a little bit of information about the issue that you're asking them to react to. These are two questions that were actually asked, one from the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, one from the CBS poll. They were done at the same time. January of 2014 are the field dates for both of them. And the question wording here ends up producing a really significant difference. So this is around Edward Snowden. And you can see in the NBC poll, the respondents were asked, when it comes to Edward Snowden, the former government contractor who released information about how government agencies collect intelligence data to media outlets, do you support or oppose what he did? If you don't have an opinion either way, just say so. So there was a, respondents were given the choice to say that they did not have an opinion or weren't sure. Now, some important choices about questions. The government contractor who released information, I am sure that there was a long debate about whether to use the word released or leaked, or how what Edward Snowden did was going to be described. You can see CBS made some different decisions about describing the same situation. As you may know, Edward Snowden leaked, so they chose to use the word leaked as opposed to released, information about a government program to help find terrorists that involved collecting phone and internet records in the United States and in foreign countries. So the setup to the question is very different, right? You've used the word leaked, you've talked about terrorism, you've talked about collecting phone and internet records. Over here, you've provided less information. One of the things that happens when you provide less information is that you get a much stronger no opinion, not sure. And I, at least in the context of this presentation, am not really making an argument about which is right or wrong. As I said earlier, there are wrong ways to ask a question, for sure. But there's typically not one right way to ask a question. You've got to be thoughtful and transparent about it, and you've got to make conscious decisions about the words that you're using. So on the left, you can see that the result is, or the headline is, Americans oppose what Snowden did by 14 points, 37 to 23, but the largest plurality of Americans have no opinion about it. They just don't know enough. In the CBS framing of the question, wow, it's a very different looking result. A 54% majority of Americans disapprove of what Snowden did, instead of by 14 points in the NBC poll on the left, but by 23 points on the right, 54 to 31, with a much smaller margin saying that they don't know. So this is just a kind of a quick case study about two media outlets doing absolutely the best that they can to frame the question neutrally. Neither one of these organizations wants to put their foot on, or put their finger on the scale and be biased one way or the other. This is an attempt to extract information and attitudes without supplying prejudicial information. But you can see it becomes impossible as soon as you start to choose words to explain what it is you're trying to measure, you're introducing measurement bias. So let me take you through a couple of more slides, and then I want to make sure that I save time for questions. And I'm sorry, but I think, let me just see if I can jump ahead. Lisa, I don't know if you can make my screen larger now that I just jumped ahead, but let me see if I can do that. Thank you. Okay, so this is an example of top line data. This is how, if you click on a link in the reporting of poll results, you will get taken to a questionnaire that looks something like this, which is the questions, the order in which they were asked, the exact script, so exactly how the question was framed, whether it was in an online survey or through a live interviewer, exactly how the question was asked, and then you see the percentages of respondents who responded to each category. So this is a hypothetical matchup in a congressional race between Marsha Jones and John Smith. And you can see from the results in question 11, if you want to go back and check the way the poll is being reported on, that Smith, in fact, has an 8-point lead over his opponent Jones, 42-34. One of the things you'd want to think about is, do you want to incorporate the voters who are leaning in that direction or not? So you could say, you know, a headline could be, Smith leads Jones by 8 points. That seems pretty significant. Already, we want to know what's the margin of error on the poll, how many people were interviewed, is this likely voters, is it registered voters? I go back and look at and say, in this case, if you add in what we call the leaners, or the voters who are leaning toward each candidate, it doesn't change the result here because it's even. It doesn't change the net result of an 8-point lead. But sometimes when you add the leaning voters in, it can change the result quite a bit. I also noted here, it's in February. So, you know, if it's late October, I think counting the leaners in toward that candidate is a justifiable thing to do. Probably in January or February, if you're only leaning toward that candidate, there's still a lot of the campaign to play out. And then when you look here, this might not be something that's reported in the result of the poll, but in order for you, if you're really trying to make sense of the race and you click on this, I would take a look at this and say, gee, okay, Jones is in question 11. He is up over his opponent. I'm sorry, Smith is up over his opponent Jones by 8 points. But when I look at question 12, and voters are then asked a follow-up question, how certain they are to stick with that candidate. Boy, Jones's vote is a lot more solidified here than Smith. So 2/3, 67% of Jones voters say they're certain they're voting for her. 58% of Smith voters say the same. So if I had the luxury as a reporter of being able to write a few paragraphs about this race, I would want to make a note that while Smith is advantaged right now because he's up by 8 points, in looking at some of the other data in the survey, there are some promising signs here for Jones, who's behind, but her vote is much more solidified. So being able to tell the totality of the story is important. And then let me take you to a second second set of raw data. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word crosstabs, they immediately like plug their ears and think that's technical. It's not for me. I don't know what crosstabs are. Crosstabs are really simple and they are a really important part of the story. So let me just take right here, looking at the results by race of the respondent. So remember, we have Smith is in the lead, but now if I look across racial categories, I can see that actually Smith is significantly in the lead among white voters, right? So by 56, I'm just using my cursor here, by 56-31, Smith is leading among white voters, but the opposite is true among African-American voters. Jones is in the lead 59-27. Among Hispanic voters, the race is a little closer, with Smith in the lead 47-42. But that's an important part of the story as well, especially when you're not really right on the eve of the election, but you want to sort of see how's the dynamic of the race shaping up. What does Jones need in order to kind of catch up? What does Smith need to do to hold his lead? So being able to look at some of the key themes behind the top line data, that's really critical as well. Okay, and then I want to close up and with a couple of lessons from 2016, and then we can go back to the chat room and have a discussion and answer questions. So as I said at the outset, 2016 was considered, I think wrongly, to be a significant failure of polling. When you look at the national polls, most of them were actually pretty close and pretty accurate, had Hillary Clinton up by narrow single digits, which is what she won the popular vote by. Where the polls were really off in 2016 were at the state level, and that matters in a close race. Donald Trump, you know, I think by most historical accounts, you know, really kind of got the, you know, the inside straight here in terms of the Electoral College. was able to win the narrow battleground state, win narrowly battleground states that gave him an electoral college victory. The reason I think when I say we, I think the industry in general, although some people did have, more insights and really kind of stood out for getting this early on, is that the quality of the state polls and the size of the samples in the state polls, particularly in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, were bad. Media outlets in those states, and often it's like a partnership between a media outlet or a state newspaper and a university there. They are not well funded. They do as much as they can to save their budget for every 4 years, doing a significant poll. Often those polls are of 400 or at the most 600 voters. So they're noisy, and I say noisy meaning they have a high margin of error. They are also not especially, because they're not polling all the time the way national outlets are. They're less attuned to things that are happening in terms of likely voter models. And so that wasn't reflected in state polls. The kind of takeaway of 2016, or one of the key takeaways, and the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers, APOR, which is the trade association or professional association for both academic and commercial public opinion researchers, had an amazing conference post 2016, and appointed sort of a blue panel commission to really write an extensive report on not only what happened, but what needed to be improved and fixed. And one of the key takeaways is that in those battleground states, the composition of the electorate was slightly off, and that the polls underrepresented white non-college educated voters. And that was done because based on their vote history in the past, they voted in 2016 at a disproportionately higher rate than they had in the past. And so the polls were using assumptions based on past behavior and past performance. And as I said earlier, campaigns matter. The Trump campaign did a very good job at targeting those voters, turning them out, raising their share of the electorate just enough to make a significant difference. Now, if you had underestimated white non-college educated voters by a couple of points, maybe 2 or 3 points, that might not be a very big deal if those voters looked like all other voters in terms of their preference for their candidate. But that was not the case in 2016. White non-college educated voters, particularly in those battleground states, went as much as 70-30 for President Trump. So underestimating them by 2 or 3 points, given their decisive preference for President Trump, ended up being a significant difference in the outcome of those polls. So one of the things I'm very heartened to see, I guess, in 2020 is that major outlets, NBC, CNN, have invested significant resources into doing statewide polling in the battleground states. So you see now significant polls being released in those 3, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, but also in emerging battleground states, Arizona, North Carolina, Florida, even now Ohio. And so it's not just that we have kind of 2 or 3 or 4 one-off polls being done in those states, which is the case in 2016. I think the industry and researchers have really learned their lesson. They have banked and raised resources to do significant, expensive quality polling in those states. So I think we're in a much better place. And then a couple of other caveats that I want to make, and this is true of 2016, but it's true of 2020 as well, and it will always be true. Polls are not predictive. They are always a snapshot of when the data was collected. So by the time I go to report on the findings from my poll, the data is already has a shelf life, because the interviewing took place yesterday and things today are not the same thing as they were yesterday. That seems to be particularly true in this election cycle where things are happening and our heads are spinning. But it was true in 2016. We didn't capture the Comey letter. Polls are always, they're like a lagging indicator, if you will, because they are looking at the time in which the data was collected, which is always past. So they are never meant to be predictive. And anytime they're used that way, then polls are being misused. And I said at the beginning, polling is a science. It's also an art, because there are decisions to make about, question wording that are not sort of an empirically right or wrong way. So there are judgments to be made. It's both an art and a science, but it is not magic. It is not predictive. It is always a snapshot. It is never about the future. Something is going to happen between now and the event that you're measuring that is going to change that dynamic. And the other couple ways I think in which polling is commonly misused, and I guess I'd provide real cautionary guidance for anyone. I think polling aggregators, I love 538, I love the upshot on the New York Times, I love data, and so the more data, the better. But there is kind of a slippery slope we can fall into that says, oh, well, if all the polls are a little off and we just throw them into a big polling aggregator, that will even out kind of all the bumps and all the noise, and we'll end up with, we'll end up with something that's more definitive and more decisive. And that's not the case. Polling aggregators are exactly that. They aggregate whatever quality data you're putting in is what that aggregator is going to produce. So it's not as though you can put poor quality polls in a polling aggregator and arrive with quality data. What goes into those formulas and what goes in to those decision-making instruments is really critical. And so taking those aggregators and then using them as a forecasting model, I think is a real misuse of polling data. And the other, I guess, egregious example, I would say, of using polling data, and both parties have now done it. In 2016, in the first CNN presidential debate on the Republican side, there were like 16 candidates, I think, or 14 or 16 candidates, too many to have all on one debate stage. And so the way placement in the debate was determined was through candidates' average in national polls. And so I think I'm remembering this to be true. In 2016, Chris Christie made it into the varsity debate, which was kind of like the A-team debate, because he was like 0.3% ahead of Carly Fiorina in national polling, and she was in the JV debate as a result of her polling average. That is an egregious misuse of polling data. As we've just seen in terms of margin of error, 0.3 or 0.5% difference in a national average, especially when you're in the spring before an election, you're 6 months out before an election, is meaningless. And instead, it's actually kind of dangerous, because what it does is it implies a level of precision to the results that was never meant to be there. And so I was, I guess, heartened to see a somewhat improvement in 2020 on the Democratic side, when polling was not the single determining factor about which candidates made it into the debate, but it still was a factor. So it was one of three. I think the other factors were around fundraising and around ballot access. And so the Democratic Party kind of realized that the Republicans had been roundly criticized in 2016 for misusing polling. And so they added additional factors, but they still kind of there wasn't still a very transparent acknowledgement that polling is not meant to be used, again, as a predictor of a candidate's future viability. And so to the extent that you flag or see polling being used in that regard, it's great to be able to speak up and explain that that was never meant to be that was never what polls were designed to use. And I think when we use them that way, what we do is undermine their value and their utility. There's real value and utility there, but only when it's done in kind of a transparent way that embraces the limitations of polling and survey research. So with that, I've spoken enough, and let me go to questions, and I can go to the chat and see. So first question here, can polling affect voter turnout? Does it diminish the urgency to vote? I think in certain circumstances, it really can. There's been some studies about that in 2016 about complacency, right? That the polls basically showed a narrow but consistent margin for Hillary Clinton. And so as a result, did that discourage turnout? And I think there is some evidence to that. And one of the points I made throughout is that campaigns matter. How campaigns choose to spend their money and motivate their audience and their GOTV efforts, they matter in terms of those things matter in terms of who shows up on election day. But also I think over promising or providing too much assurance that the polls have it locked up and it's determinative and it's over, I think it absolutely does have a diminishing effect in terms of voters, and they're feeling like they can make a difference, especially in a year like this one, where showing up at the polls is, a very significant decision. People feel like they're taking, a risk with their health, or if not, they're making a pretty significant decision to apply for an absentee ballot. Polling is not easy or simple or costless this year. And so anything we do that makes the cost or reward proposition to be different for voting, I think has real ability to affect turnout. Okay, so another good question about people not being truthful. So that was one of the truthful in their survey responses. So going into 2016 in the postmortem, which was a really deep dive into what happened into 2016, and credit to APOR, the Professional and Trade Association, kind of put all hypotheses in the mix. And so the idea of there being a shy Trump voter in 2016 was very real, that maybe these people, Trump supporters, were embarrassed about, or they were just reluctant to tell an interviewer that they were supporting President Trump, that wasn't seen as kind of a socially desirable answer. And so a couple of things were done. We compared live phone interviewing with online interviewing, because you'd think if there was a social desirability effect that it would be less online, because you don't have somebody kind of judging or evaluating your answer in real time. And there really wasn't a difference in Trump support between online polling and live interviewing polling. So that was one factor that caused, I think, APOR to say, yeah, the try-shump voter theory, it's a good theory and it was absolutely worth exploring, but they didn't see much evidence of it. The more significant result is not that, or the more significant problem, I think, is not that Trump voters were lying or, sort of hedging on their answer and not acknowledging their strong support for Trump. It's that they were less likely to participate in or cooperate in polls. And that's different. That's something called a non-response bias, which means that certain people who share certain characteristics are less likely to participate in a poll. So if you have Trump voters who are less likely to cooperate and participate in a poll, then you're including fewer of them. So I think it was less a matter of social desirability or kind of giving the wrong answer, as it was some other factors that caused us to misjudge Trump support, especially in some of the battleground states. Other questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat if you'd like.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
I can.
What are the polls showing about the white uneducated voter this election?
Right. That's a really good question, and I'd say it's one of the areas that reporters and researchers are putting the most focus on. Especially, I think in this business, you're always trying to compensate for your past mistakes. So I think the industry, knowing that we as an industry sort of misjudged or undercounted non-college educated voters in 2016. We want to be really careful not to do it again. But then there's a lot of kind of speculation that those voters a little more disenchanted with Trump. They may still be voting for him, but they're less motivated. And so I think one of the really unknown questions right now is, are they going to remain at their elevated turnout level? So, you know, at 2012 and in the past, they were that demographic audience was at a certain kind of composition of turnout. In 2016, they elevated their turnout slightly higher. And what happens to them in 2020? You know, I've seen sort of good argument and speculation and data on both sides. I think it will make a significant difference what happens in those critical states. So it's not sort of non-college educated voters nationally. It's really in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, a couple of other critical states. You see that's where, or at least before I got on this call, I saw that the president had announced that he was going to go back to campaigning, and I think is hitting those states. So it's hard to say right now, because what happens over the next 3 weeks, I think, is going to be really critical in turning them out. Certainly the Trump campaign is concerned about that, and they are targeting their efforts at energizing that constituency. If they don't turn out at that elevated level that they produced in 2016, that is a real problem for him. So I think it's a source of serious concern, because there are indicators that they are still Trump supporters. They're certainly not warm to Biden, or they haven't converted and feel as though, you know, oh, you know, Biden is their man. But I think it's more likely that they will kind of reduce that elevated sort of level of engagement and go back to being their regular size of the voting electorate.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me just see in the chat. What does it mean when polls are vastly different? Wall Street Journal has Biden at 14. Ipsos only had it for 8. Similar sample size and dates. I haven't looked at those two polls. I think Ipsos is online. I know methodologically, Ipsos typically is online in 2020. Wall Street Journal is a phone interview. I don't know if there's a difference between their voter screen, likely voters, and registered voters. So I'd have to go back and look at it. I also would want to go back and look at the question wording and see whether respondents were offered the choice of still being unsure or undecided. Especially in an online poll, we tend to force people to respond and not offer them a not sure. On the phone, it's much easier to capture what we call a volunteered not sure. So we may say on the phone, who are you voting for, Trump or Biden? And a respondent then says, gee, I'm not sure yet. And that's kind of a volunteered answer. Online, we don't offer that volunteered option. So all of those differences between, if I'm right, that Wall Street Journal is a live telephone interview and Ipsos is an online poll, all of those, they seem like they're kind of nerdy methodological differences, but the difference between, you know, it's a 6-point difference between a 14-point lead and an 8-point lead. And those adjustments or those methodological differences can definitely account for 6 points. Other questions about polls that you're seeing or about how they're being reported? Whether it just sounds like a big crazy cacophony of polls that don't make any sense, or whether it's actually, the thing I also get concerned about in terms of reporting on polling is that, and this is a issue in reporting and journalism generally, is that there becomes a narrative and then everybody is signing on to the narrative, right? And I think the narrative in 2016 is that Clinton is going to win a close race, and that was sort of the narrative. And I get very, very cautious and nervous about narratives about polling because it's a very, very dynamic indicator. And so, you know, putting a narrative on it where it's kind of like, okay, we've summarized it, we've put a label on it, and now we're done and we don't have to revisit that narrative. I think that becomes very, very troublesome. So, you know, I hope in the closing days of this that if Biden continues to have a, you know, comfortable, I guess, national lead, that we avoid, and we reporters, the media writ large, avoid that idea of kind of putting that narrative. It's unintentional, but it becomes a kind of a narrative stamp that this race is, you know, is pretty well decided. A question about online polling is going to be more secure since technology is going to evolve very fast and will be the only alternative. So that is a great question. I am, I hate to say this because it's going to make you realize exactly how old I am, but when I was in graduate school and I did a master's program at the University of Michigan in survey research, we actually went door to door in Detroit and interviewed people in there on their doorsteps. That obviously makes me a dinosaur. I was the very last year that they did that, and the next year they switched to phone interviewing for safety and other reasons. But that was how data was collected, you know, 25 years ago. It was certainly done on the phone, but there was still door-to-door interviewing going on to collect survey data. And, you know, then by the time I finished graduate school and got into the practice of commercial public opinion research, it was all done by phone. And that was all great for, you know, 10 or 15 years. And I just think that this crossroads that we're at in terms of making the transition from phone interviewing to online interviewing is going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to be bumpy, but it is the way that we're going. And I think, Selma, you bring up some really important points in your question about it's becoming more secure. So we have more control over our online platforms. They can't be crashed. We can't have hackers take them over. We're able on the back end as researchers to go look and see how much time a respondent took engaging with the survey so that we have some quality control measures. That we were originally, I think, very nervous about. We call them racers or speeders, people who just go rip through a questionnaire and don't, you know, respond with any thought or quality. So the technology is catching up and enabling us to sort of provide assurances that we have greater quality. In addition, the panels of respondents, so the population that we choose from when we select our interviews, the panels are becoming much more representative, and that's because online access is increasing and becoming kind of more universal. And so the quality of the panels, they are representative. They are not, you know, even 5 years ago, online panels were like white, educated, older, you know, a little older, just because young people never volunteer to be part of data collection. But there were real biases in our online panels, and those are going away through, you know, deliberate efforts by vendors to try and diversify their panels and make them more representative. But for all the reasons that you mentioned, Selma, a lot of the problems and the issues that we had 5 years ago with online polling, we're addressing a lot of those. And given the response rates that are, you know, 3% and lower for phone surveys, I don't see how there's a future in that. So we've got to get the online platforms kind of better and improved, but I really think that's where we're headed. We're headed for the future.
If you're a dinosaur, then I'm an ancient alien. I was a freshman at American University, and I walked into Birch Bay's campaign office, and they said, "Who are you?" And I said, "My name, and I'm here to volunteer." Literally walked in second semester of his first campaign. And, oh, the technology? They were just introducing fax machines. And we still had teletype machines for AP and UPI wire services.
Well, it's in some ways. So I did graduate school, and I had that applied practical survey research where a partner and I went door to door in Detroit in February and interviewed people for our study. But in undergrad, my work study or my job was that I worked at our university phone bank. We had a small research center. It was in Rhode Island. And so, you know, doing interviewing in Rhode Island is always interesting because there's a lot of, often there are candidates whose names are very hard to pronounce. And so one of the things that we had to do at the beginning of each session was we'd have to go through a pronunciation script so that and it's very important for interviewers to not trip over their words and to say things correctly and pronounce people's names correctly. So it was, I mean, I sort of laugh at it now, but it was great training for me because it made me then going in, you know, to the business as a researcher, I always know now, I feel like I've got real firsthand experience with what research is like from the perspective of a respondent. So it's humbling to be on the phone and asking somebody what you think is a really thoughtful question. And then as soon as you say it and you hear the silence at the other end, you realize you've totally missed the mark, right? You've presented a question that is too long, it's too confusing, it has too many caveats, it's too hard to remember. And so that's a really, really good experience as a researcher to spend some time at a phone bank, watching the data being collected, watching the experience from the perspective of the respondent. You can write what you think is a brilliant questionnaire. You can design your sample flawlessly, but if your respondent isn't able to engage with you in a meaningful way, then it really compromises the quality of the data. So there's so many different angles to think of this as, and so, you know, now with online platforms, it's different as a respondent, whether we like or not. We've got to make our questionnaires mobile friendly. Everybody's sitting at a desktop, taking it on a full screen. You know, they may be engaging with the survey when they're, you know, on the bus, and they've got to be able to see it on the small screen of their phone. So it's, as I said, it's humbling, but it's really important to remember that designing a beautiful instrument is a great thing, but you have to consider the experience of the respondent if you really want to produce a quality product.
Which leads to something that I think is interesting in what you mentioned. I live in Boston, and if you have more people who are minorities, who are originally, you know, they were born here but have their parents' last name, you go to Children's Hospital in Boston, there are over 50 languages on the board outside, my son told me, for translators. And as you get more people do that, the online surveys, I think, will take it better because people can't pronounce the last names.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not Smith and Jones and Brown anymore, or Miller.
Right. And increasingly, I think the onus is on us as researchers to, you know, what our goal as a researcher, really, when you think about it, is we want to go into the public or to a population, and if we could just scientifically, surgically extract their attitudes and their opinions without having to interact with them, without having to ask them questions, that would be ideal, because that would reduce measurement error and a lot of the cost and everything else. But we can't do that. To set up an experience in which we interact with people to get them to report their attitudes and opinions. And increasingly, there's no one good way to do that. So for seniors, if I was doing a poll for AARP and my target audience was, you know, Americans over 60, I would not probably dominantly use an online platform to collect data. There's plenty of, I understand, you know, there's plenty of seniors who are very comfortable interacting that way, but I wouldn't do it only that way. Whereas if I was doing, if I were the Biden campaign and I was looking to kind of turn out young voters in the next 3 weeks and I wanted to do a big research project, there's doing it by phone. You know, they just don't answer their phone. I've got to think of lots of cool ways to link my survey or my data collection efforts to where those people are spending their time on social media and other platforms. So it's more challenging because there's not, you know, it used to be just get on the phone, turn on the phones from 6 to 10 at night. It was really annoying. We disrupted everyone's dinner. Everyone hated us for that. But that was like the standard way of collecting data. There is no longer one standard way. There's way too many platforms, and you have to be really mindful of your audience and your respondent in order to get a good response rate. Any other questions or comments that folks want to make? All right, well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed this. I hope I've made everybody more enthusiastic and not more cynical, because that is certainly my goal. I love research. I'm a huge believer in it, but I just believe that it should be done transparently, and that you really have to own and embrace the strengths and the limitations of what research can do. Giving you some insights in that regard. All right, well, with that, have a nice weekend, everybody. And thanks again for taking the time to dial in on Friday afternoon.